So as we go around the county road, you might kind of take a look back and look at some of these beets. You can still see kind of, but we've got some planting date studies. And so you'll notice some strips of beets that look really big and healthy, and then they kind of get weaker as you go through. What that study is something that's been kind of an interest of mine on looking at replanted sugar beets and how weed control might be affected by those replants. I always joke when I give talks about sugar beets that growers in our region tend to kind of have this mindset that if you don't plant them twice, you didn't plant them early enough. And so we do replant a lot of beets, and it's primarily because we have really crappy weather here a lot. You know, we have high winds, we have freezing temperatures late in the season, you know, hailstorms, whatever else. And so we do end up replanting a lot of beets. And so it got me thinking, you know, especially with Roundup Ready beets where we're not using a lot of residual herbicide products, you know, what impact do those planting dates have on weed control and our recommendations that we're making? Because most of the recommendations we make are based on our research plots that we plant, you know, at a really good time every year. And so we're, you know, planting between April 15th and April 30th. And if you look at when weeds emerge, you know, different species emerge at different times. They're adapted to different climates, different soil temperatures. So early in the season, and particularly in sugar beet production, we know the biggest weeds that we have are kochia and lamb's quarters in this region. The reason that is because those are the weeds that emerge about the same time as the sugar beet crop. So, you know, early in the season, those are the weeds that we get emerging. Now, if you look at when we plant our corn, we don't have kochia quite as much of a problem, but lamb's quarters tends to be a little bit more, and then we start seeing some red root pigweed and nightshade. And if you look at dry beans, which we plant even later, it's primarily nightshade and pigweed, and a lot of that has to do with the timing of planting. So, it kind of then leads to the question, well, are we making good recommendations based on research that's done when we're planting early for growers that are having to replant and come in and plant, you know, May 1st, May 15th even? So what we've got is some planting date studies down here where we actually plant the beets at various times. I think our first one went on April 20th this year, and then at 2-week intervals to simulate those replanted beets. And one of the things we're finding is the later you plant, the less the weed density is. And so already we're talking that, you know, maybe we do need to modify our recommendations for these late planted beets because the weeds just aren't going to be quite as competitive. But also we're seeing a shift in the weed spectrum from kochia and lamb's quarters early in the season. And when those replanted beets come up, a lot of our weed problems tend to be pigweed and nightshade, just like we're dealing with in dry beans. And so the herbicides that we're recommending may also change as we delay that planting date into the season. So that's one of the things that we're dealing with in the sugar beets, and you'll notice as we drive by, you'll see some of those things. In the dry beans, which is this strip back here behind me, you'll notice that you can kind of see sticking above the canopy, and it'll be a lot more obvious as we go down the county road. It looks like there's some corn growing in those beans. There it is, corn, and we planted it there, but we're calling it volunteer corn. So you'll notice also as you drive through a lot of sugar beet fields and dry bean fields in our region, especially if you take a trip down Highway 26 down through Scotts Bluff and that area, there's a lot of volunteer corn popping up through those sugar beet and dry bean canopies. And one of the questions that we get is, well, how competitive is it? Do I really need to go out there and waste money spraying or sending a hand crew through to get rid of that volunteer corn? And the main answer that we've had up to this point is we don't really know how competitive it is, how much yield loss you're getting. So I'm actually working with Gustavus Batella and Robert Wilson over at the University of Nebraska, and we've had trials in both sugar beets and dry beans to really figure out how competitive is that volunteer corn. What density does that volunteer corn have to be at before we go out and actually warrant, you know, spending the money to get rid of it? And then how early do we have to go out? So can we wait 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks into the season, or is that too late? Have we already started seeing yield loss if we wait that long? And so you'll see that, and so those are just a few of the studies that we're working on that I think are kind of relevant. They're the questions that we get from growers, and they're the ones that we didn't know the good answers to. And so that's kind of what we're doing. We do have a lot of other things going out. I think we've got, you know, basically from here, halfway through the sugar beet block is all sugar beet studies. We've got some Valorin dry beans, looking at that as a potential new option for certain scenarios. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer, but those are a couple of the things that we're doing that I think are some of the more fun stuff that we're doing these last couple of years.
What's causing your suppression of your growth? These are dry beans here.
Yes, this actually is not my study, and I don't know what that might be. I may have had a corn study there last year, and we may have sprayed some atrazine, so that might be it. That's why I'm on the south side of the strip most of the time. they don't like other researchers to have to follow me. So that's why I don't have any studies in there, and I hope no one else puts them there. So. Yeah, weed scientists should. I've been arguing for that a long time. I think I should just get this area, and then the other researchers can go over back there, but it hasn't happened yet. So, but that may be part of what's going on here.
Andrew, I assume this volunteer corn problem is because of the Roundup Ready, right?
Well, so the volunteer corn problem isn't because of Roundup Ready. That's why we see an increase in the sugar beets, but not in the dry beans. We don't have any Roundup Ready beans.
Right.
And we still get a lot of volunteer corn in our dry bean crop. So that's not the whole issue, but we have seen a huge increase in volunteer corn and sugar beets because of Roundup Ready, because we're following Roundup Ready corn with Roundup Ready sugar beets. And, the old herbicides in sugar beets used to get rid of the corn, because we have, herbicides that we're spraying that are effective on that corn. But now in sugar beets we're using primarily Roundup, and so we're not able to get that corn with the Roundup with our standard program. So we've also had some control studies to figure out which grass herbicides we can tank mix safely with glyphosate, what kind of oil adjuvants, and we're actually just summarizing that data now. So in next year's bulletin that we're going to do for the field days again, I assume we're doing that again, Brett, right?
Yep.
So in next year's bulletin we'll have a report on the summarized 4 years of data, or 4 site years of data, 2 at Scottsbluff, 2 at here, and come up with some solid recommendations. When do you have to apply? What density warrants application? And which herbicides and adjuvant systems are going to be the best for that particular problem.